There is this ideology that permeates Western societies that's basically a justification for Zionism, for Israel. I made one informal video about it on my main channel a couple of months ago, and I call it Jewish exceptionalism. And basically its tenets are this idea that Jewish people are innately oppressed. They have an innate essence that makes them special, that their oppression is not something that can possibly ever change, that it has not changed. It's just something they sort of carry in the blood for all eternity. And because they are innately oppressed, Jews are innately also allowed to do things that would be unacceptable if other people did them. And also, you are anti-Semitic if you don't agree with this. And you see this absolutely everywhere. It's the bedrock of international propaganda justifying the state of Israel, in Western countries especially. We're going to go over just one recent example of this ideology. It's actually an extremely good demonstration of it, though I don't want you to think this is the only instance of it ever, because it's not. It's something incredibly well known. This is just an example of it. It comes from everyone's favorite YouTube streamer, LonerBox. And you could also call this the appeal to Jewishness fallacy, where the entire argument is actually you're wrong because they're Jewish. There's something special about Jews that makes what Israel does more permissible. And if you don't take that into account, you are an anti-Semite. Settler colonialism, genocide, ethnic cleansing, what have you. That might be wrong under normal circumstances, but you completely fail to take into account the innate mystical nature of Jewish people. Ergo, you are wrong, ergo you are anti-Semitic. So LonerBox's fans thought this 1 minute long clip was so awesome that they edited it together with music, inspirational music and archival footage and stuff like that, and made an inspiring pro-Israel propaganda video out of it. So let's actually watch this clip, and we're going to analyze the argument. First, we'll deal with the argument and the material facts that he brings up. The most important thing is always, are the justifications actually true? Are the things that he is bringing up actually true? Did it actually happen in the way that he's saying? And then we move on to okay, does this logic make any sense? And then we'll test this argument and see how much it actually holds up, or if it's just a gish gallop appeal to Jewishness fallacy, as I just said. Basically just arguing that Jews have some sort of innately oppressed essence that permeates through space and time, and ergo, we must all come together to allow them to do basically whatever they want to Palestinians. Let's watch.
The majority of people who live in Israel are refugees from the Arab and Muslim world. The rest of them are largely people who came from the Holocaust, or from 1300 pogroms in Russia, or from anti-Semitism rising in the 20s and 30s. That's why they're there. And you are treating them like they are just some imperial back colony like French Algeria or South Africa or something else. And you think that these people are ever going to be dislodged. There's two things that are never going to happen in that country, okay? One is they're not going to accept being a minority. Never. Not the way that Jews have been treated in the Middle East as minorities by every other Arab Muslim country. They're also never going to leave because they have nowhere else to go. As long as you ignore the real reality and the lived experience of Jews that created Zionism, as long as you keep treating a genuine movement of people who were refugees, who had nowhere else to go in the world, going to a place and deciding, this is our home. If this is not our home, we die. And you don't acknowledge that because you just think it's, white Europeans coming with the British and the American. Then yes, you're anti-Semitic because your entire analysis of Israel is completely ignorant of the real experience of Jews that resulted in them going to Palestine.
Let's first analyze the facts here. First claim.
The majority of people who live in Israel are refugees from the Arab and Muslim world. The rest of them are largely people who came from the Holocaust, or from 1300 pogroms in Russia, or from anti-Semitism rising in the 20s and 30s.
Are the majority of people in Israel refugees? No. The majority of people in Israel are not refugees. You are not a refugee because your great-grandpa was. I think that is pretty clear, right? You know who are actually refugees? Palestinians. Palestinians are refugees. You know why? Because Israelis kicked them out and made them so. And they have since been kept out of possibly returning to their lands, to their homes, by those same Israelis. And thus, they are still refugees. Israelis are not refugees. A refugee is someone who, is kicked out of a place, wants to return, but cannot for reasons beyond their control. Or someone who is kept from returning, whatever. Not a refugee, because according to LonerBox here, 80 years ago, 70 years ago, 60 years ago, your grandpa was kicked out of somewhere. Let's get that off the table first. You're not a perennial refugee forever. Same way that I'm not a refugee because 100 years ago, one of my Greek ancestors was kicked out of Turkey or whatever. Two, the facts he lays it out is simply incorrect. I went over this in my video on the supposed mass expulsions of Jews from the Arab world. This one right here. Key facts from that is, one, massive portions of the Jews who left the so-called Arab world did so voluntarily because, it's a pretty good fucking deal to go to Palestine and take someone else's house, isn't it? Two, because Israel pressured the governments there to basically make deals with them to force the Jews of their country out. And then three, there was a portion that were actually expelled. And then also on top of that, you also have to acknowledge that 20 years later in the 70s, in some cases less than 20 years later, in some cases 10 years later, those countries came together as a bloc to offer return to all of those Jews who had left or been expelled. All of them. So when you're offered return, you are not a refugee. Quite simple. Obviously, they did not take them up on this because this whole point is a red herring. It's an attempt to draw a false equivalence between the Palestinian refugee problem, which is an actually existing real refugee problem, and the Jewish refugee problem, which doesn't exist. Two, this idea that there is like some sort of perennial Jewish terror and Jews cannot live anywhere as a minority is disproven by the fact that Israel is factually a less safe place to live in than fucking New York City or Buenos Aires, or any other place with a sizable minority Jewish community. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? You know what's violent? Colonialism. You know what's violent? You know what's risky? Taking someone else's house and then keeping them locked up 50 kilometers away from you, or 5 kilometers away from you, or 500 meters away from you in some situations. That is so much more dangerous than being a Jew in New York. The average Jew in New York, biggest problem is that once they got his order wrong at Starbucks, it's just simply not true. Next, let's analyze that refugee claim there. Wait, I'll let him continue. I already showed the full video, but I want him to continue because he gets to the point of bringing it up. Basically, it was to say that Jews cannot be settler colonists.
That's why they're there. And you are treating them like they are just some imperial back colony like French Algeria or South Africa or something else. And you think that these people are ever going to be dislodged.
There you go. It's anti-Semitic to treat them as if they are just like a colony or like a proxy state because they're Jewish, I guess. Another thing on that refugee point, by the way, is refugees move somewhere not because they want to take their place from the people who are there. Refugees move somewhere to seek refuge among the pre-existing population. You are not a refugee when you move straight into someone else's house. You're not a refugee when you displace someone else. You're not a refugee when you do not live alongside the previous society but destroy it. That is not what a refugee is. A refugee is someone seeking refuge among the previous population. So to call these people refugees because they went to Israel, went to a transit camp, and then moved straight into a Palestinian house, got a gun, and started massacring Gazans trying to cross the border to return to the home they were ethnically cleansed to that those people are now living in, to call those people refugees is fucking insane. If you want to know who are actually refugees today, recognized refugees, internationally recognized refugees under the same systems of international law that you constantly defer to. Palestinians, not Israelis, Palestinians. 9.1 million displaced Palestinians worldwide. 8.36 million refugees in total. Let's twist this logic around the other way. Let's flip it. And let's see if it still works. Let's see if he would agree with this statement. Palestinians, given that they are factually refugees, way more than anyone in Israel, does that mean that they cannot do atrocities, they cannot do bad things, that they are specially authorized to do bad things? That if they were to, say, do colonialism, do settler colonialism, we would have to, consider their unique ethnic situation, or we would be anti-Palestinianist? Do they have a uniquely permissible situation due to their refugee status, due to being ethnically cleansed, genocided, and massacred? Does that afford them a special right to do things that would otherwise be impermissible? Does he think that? No, he doesn't. So we need to then think about the logic here. If he thinks that Jews had a special right to do colonialism because he justifies it there with this idea that their grandparents, their great-grandparents were refugees, what is it exactly then that makes them so special? If he thinks that logic applies to Jews because 70, 80 years ago, according to him, all the Jews in the world were refugees, how does this not apply to Palestinians, given that today, right now, currently, almost all Palestinians in the world are refugees? The logic falls over immediately when you compare it to an actual contemporary, real, today, actionable example. So now we must ask a follow-up question. Why is there a distinction then? Where does this distinction come from? Why do Jews get to do settler colonialism and it's wrong to call them a colony, it's wrong to call them settlers, it's wrong to call their country a proxy state of Western powers? Why is it that you can't say that about them? Yet LonerBox would certainly never afford that sort of leeway to Palestinians. He would never ever make this sort of emotional argument for Palestinians if they were doing the same sort of thing. You can test this. He's against any sort of Palestinian political violence. There is not a single time that Palestinians have taken up arms against their oppressors that he was not against. He even has like an extensive video series where he debunks the Great March of Return and tries to justify the Israelis sniping kids during that. Quite clearly, it's not actually on the material basis here. It's not on the merit of the facts that he believes this. So why does he believe it? Jewish exceptionalism. The appeal to Jewishness fallacy. This idea of like innate Jewish oppression that is not actually grounded in reality, clearly. Because if you look at reality, if you are Jewish today, what are you most likely to be? One, like a firmly middle-class person in a Western country, functionally white in every respect. Two, an Israeli living on stolen land, with people being massacred at most 50 kilometers away in a concentration camp for your benefit. So they have to appeal to like this sort of an idea of like an essentially racial, like magical Jewish essence. It's like the reverse Nazi logic. The Nazi logic was that Jews, regardless of how materially it makes no sense to say so, regardless of how much this narrative is contradicted by the actual facts on the ground, Jews have like some sort of innate essence within them that makes them like innately subversive, extremely powerful. You know, like it doesn't actually matter that most of the Jews in Europe at the time were like living in the Pale of Settlement and relatively poor. Doesn't matter. What actually matters is this argument to like them having like some sort of magical power, mind control powers that makes them like innate oppressor somehow, even when the actual circumstance makes it clear that's impossible. Then we fast forward to today, and this sort of argument made here by the Jewish exceptionalists, those who make this ridiculous emotional argument that's basically just an appeal to Jewishness as some sort of magical thing. Their argument accepts the premise that there's some sort of magical thing about Jews. This premise that like a Jew is not like a member of like a made-up arbitrary ethnic group created by human beings, like a social construct, but rather someone imbued with some sort of innate magical essence that makes them perennially always oppressed. So that's the reverse logic. The Nazis were like, these people have like an innate essence that makes them oppress others, that makes them oppress Germans in particular. The Jewish exceptionalists today, who use this reverse logic to justify Israel, what they believe is basically Jews have like some sort of essential magical essence that makes them sort of innately oppressed and always in peril. It's the opposite. And then the solution to that is the opposite as well. The Nazis believe that they need to be killed because they are innate oppressors, while the Jewish exceptionalists believe that because Jews are innately always magically oppressed, they need to be given special permission to kill others. That would never be afforded to anyone else, no matter what, no matter how similar the circumstance is. As I just went over with the Palestinian refugee example, which LonerBox obviously would never accept as an excuse for Palestinians being allowed to do things that are normally impermissible. So when you put it on its head, the only explanation for this, when you actually assess this argument on the basis of the facts, on its logic, on the potential contradictions, and like trying to apply it to other circumstances, it falls over immediately. So the only logical step that we can take then is that it's a special argument that's only for Jews. And that's the logic at play when you boil it down to what it actually is. Another point of this, by the way, is like, it's not just arguing that Jews are oppressed. It's also elevating anti-Semitism above all other sorts of racism, of discrimination. It must be like above everything else, like uniquely bad compared to everything else. Like, you know, you could get away with saying the N-word once, but you could not get away with like being anti-Semitic. Why is that? It's a justification for Israel, obviously. All of it is just a racket that exists to justify Israel. But the logic is that you should not actually look at the material circumstances of today. You shouldn't look at how power has shifted. You shouldn't look at the fact that anti-Palestinian racism, for example, is clearly way, way worse than anti-Semitism in the present day, given that it's currently being utilized to justify the extermination of Gaza. Basically, despite the fact that it is clearly untrue, the demand is that everyone operates as if it's 1943 and the Holocaust is currently still ongoing. And yeah, that is kind of true. There is a Holocaust ongoing, but it's not of Jews. Is never again actually for everyone or not? People, by the way, abide by this. People fall into this all the time. Well-meaning people. Most people accept this logic. Most people don't contest it at all. Most people don't respond to it on a material basis, on the basis of the facts. When someone's like, what, you're anti-Semitic? Don't you know that Jews are all refugees, Jews are all innately oppressed, blah, blah, blah. Most people will be like, no, I'm not anti-Semitic. Of course anti-Semitism is as bad as you're saying, blah, blah, blah. The thing is, though, it's not. It's not. Look at the actual material circumstances today. This is not 1940 Europe. This is 2024. Power has shifted. Things have changed. Like, I remember this social media post that I saw, and I'm going to leave this as vague as possible because I don't want anyone seeking it out and harassing the the guy, and it was this anti-Zionist American Jewish guy, you know, bless his heart and all that, and he posted something like captioning a protest that he was at, a picture of a protest that he was at, and it said, Jewish liberation and Palestinian liberation are intertwined. And I saw that, and you know what I thought? Firstly, it was okay, you know, your heart's in the right place, cool. But what do you need to be liberated from exactly, man? What is it that you need to be liberated from as like an American Jewish guy from New York? And how is this even remotely comparable to Palestinian oppression? And how are these things intertwined? You know, I don't exactly think the people who are presently oppressing Palestinians and massacring them in the name of Judaism, at least they claim it's in the name of Judaism, are in a particular need of being liberated from anything. And these sorts of sentiments fundamentally result from two things. The first one I feel is like sort of like a fear of social repercussions that could happen to you if you go against the grain of like this sort of pretending the Holocaust is still ongoing thing that is used to justify Israel. That is used to sort of imply that Israel should have a special right to do things that would otherwise be impermissible. And two, and kind of related to that, because a part of the reason why people don't do this is because they might be afraid to, is the lack of an actual material analysis of the real situation in the world today, where quite clearly Jews are not like living in the Pale of Settlement as second-class citizens. Things have changed, and Jewish emancipation has very much already happened. If there is anyone who today occupies in European Western societies the same sort of position of suspicion, of being suspected of being an internal enemy that Jews did previously, it's Muslims, it's Arabs. So things have clearly changed a lot, and I think it's important that we stop pretending that they haven't. Arabs are like openly talked about by like actual European politicians, people with political systemic power, as if their existence is like some sort of cancer, like a disease that needs to be dealt with. And that is so much worse and so much more pervasive than what most anti-Semitism is today, which is hatred from people largely on the fringes, people without systemic power. Anyway, so let's move back to contesting this argument now. The same sort of argument like could be applied to, say, Liberia. Liberia was founded by American slaves. Well, guess what? They still did settler colonialism against the people who were already there. Does fleeing slavery mean that they had like special permission to create like a 200-year-long oligarchy with themselves at the top and basically do the same thing that was done to Native Americans in the US, to the African people who were already there when they got there? And all of this is also ignoring the fact that Zionism was not founded by oppressed Jews. Zionism was founded by upper middle class, petit bourge, or bourgeois people from Europe. So he said right there, like Zionism was founded by oppressed people. Like there's no actual analysis of material circumstances. It's this idea of innate Jewish oppression. Here, let me play that part.
Going to happen. Lived experience of country. They're also
lived experience. Whenever someone says lived experience, just discard it immediately. It is a worthless appeal to emotion.
Real reality and the lived experience of Jews that created Zionism. As long as you keep treating a genuine movement of people who were refugees.
A genuine refugee is people who created Zionism. Zionism was not created by refugees. Zionism was not created by oppressed people. Political Zionism as we know it was created by Theodor Herzl, who was a upper middle class petit bourgeois guy. And the movement that he founded was full of rich people, obviously. How do you think that they got the money to do what they did? They founded a bunch of joint stock companies funded with a ton of donations by people interested in the project. The founder, the like actual leader of the foundation of the state of Israel, the genocide, the Nakba, David Ben-Gurion, he famously acknowledged that, you know, he'd never really meaningfully experienced anti-Semitism before. For him, this was like a ethno-nationalist project, not some campaign to save the refugees or whatever. And now I'd like to address this next part of this argument where he's like, you have to accept it because this is what they want. He doesn't actually examine what they want, if it would be permissible in any other circumstance. He just says this is what they want, so you must accept it.
And you think that these people are ever going to be dislodged. There's two things that are never going to happen in that country, okay? One is they're not going to accept being a minority. Never. Not.
Okay, so one, Palestinians need to accommodate the fact that Israeli Jews will not accept being a minority. Why? Because they're Jewish. The appeal to Jewishness fallacy. They have a special magical essence that means that they should be able to aspire for ethnic supremacy, ethnic dominance, demographic dominance that no one else in any other circumstance it would be acceptable for them to aspire for. That's the entire argument. We can't say, well, what they want is unacceptable and we should fight against that. You can't say that, even though that would be correct in any other circumstance with any other group, because that would be anti-Semitic. They are special. They must have ethnic dominance always. They must have a demographic majority over the Palestinians who they dispossessed.
The way that Jews have been treated in the Middle East as minorities by every other Arab Muslim country. They're also never
factually incorrect. Jews in Muslim countries before the establishment of Israel, before Zionism fucked everything up, were treated the same as anyone else of any other Abrahamic religion. Obviously, they were treated the same as Christians, basically. There was not some sort of special anti-Semitism in the Muslim world like there was in the European world. In fact, against anti-Semitic campaigns in Europe, whenever Jews fled those, they went to the Muslim countries, obviously. Like, they were disadvantaged for not being Muslim, not for specifically being Jewish. There's a difference between those things. In Europe, Jews were specifically targeted for being Jews, not just for not being Christian. Distinctions made between them and others on the basis of them being Jewish specifically. So obviously it's not the same thing. One thing that these people like to do, LonerBox does it all the time, they want to reframe, they want to blame European anti-Semitism, which was unique to Europe up until the early 20th century, when in response to Zionism, it was adopted by limited parts of the Arab world. They want to blame that on Arabs. They want to blame that on Muslims. Simply not true. There was religious discrimination in Muslim countries, but it was on the basis of not being Muslim, not specifically being Jewish. Anti-Semitism was a specifically European construct. A Jew in Europe could convert to Christianity and then would still be looked upon as a Jew by blood for the rest of their life. A Jew in a Muslim country could convert to Islam and then be treated the same as anyone else. And that is the difference. Anti-Semitism, specific anti-Semitism, not just religious discrimination, is the first one, not the second. Let's think about Israel, for example. Can a Palestinian convert to Judaism and become an Israeli? They can't. They're specifically excluded by law. Great example of how the exact same strategies that were employed against Jews in the past are employed by Israel against Palestinians today. Anyway, so what else does our friend here say? He continues his rant about like how you have to accept what Israelis want to do to Palestinians, like how they would never accept one state, they would never accept Palestinians being on equal footing to them. Why? They just wouldn't accept that, and they're Jewish. You can't say that's wrong. They're Jewish. What are you, anti-Semitic?
going to leave because they have nowhere else to go. As long as
that's just simply not true. There are more Jews outside of Israel than there are in Israel. Tons of them have dual citizenship. They very obviously do have other places to go. Not that anyone is saying they would have to go. That's something that you bring up. Though obviously, if you're living in someone else's house, yeah, obviously that should be given back to them. Just like how, for example, the Arab countries in the 1970s offered people who were expelled from Arab countries in the decades prior the ability to return and have all their property returned to them. Something that Israel cannot say.
You ignore the real reality and the lived experience of Jews.
Just ignoring the lived experiences. It's just such a banal appeal to emotion. It's so basic, so stupid.
Created Zionism. As long as you keep treating a genuine movement of people who were refugees, who had nowhere else to go in the world.
How many people in Israel have ever been refugees today? What do you think? Like a couple 100,000 at most, maybe? But you lose any sort of claim to refugee status. If you might have once had a claim to it, you lose that the second that you move somewhere into someone else's house, the second that you move somewhere, not to live alongside people, not to take refuge among them, but to destroy them in their society and take it for yourself. That is the moment where you lose any claim to being a refugee. Simple. The Puritans who laid the groundwork for what would later become the USA, the Native American genocide, they were refugees from religious persecution in Britain. You know when they stopped being refugees? The second they started attacking Native Americans, the second they started taking their land, the second that they did anything aside from seek refuge among them is when they stopped being refugees. If you look at any sort of international definition of refugee today, is a refugee someone who invades someone else's country and takes their land? I'm pretty sure it's not. I'm pretty sure it's not included.
World, going to a place and deciding this is our home. If this is not our home, we die. And
wait, they went there and they decided that it was theirs. They went there and they decided that it was theirs. He's literally arguing that they went there, they said it's theirs, It's theirs. You're anti-Semitic if you think otherwise. They went there, they expelled the Palestinians, they genocided them, they ethnically cleansed them, they massacred them, they confined them to concentration camps, they continue to settle their lands to this very day. They decided this land was theirs, and they don't want to leave. They don't want to give anything up to their victims. And you need to respect that. Why? Because they're Jewish. The entire argument just goes back to this sort of mystical Jewish essence. It's literally just the appeal to Jewishness fallacy. The end of every single argument, when you get to the crux of it, is Jewish. They are Jewish. They are Jewish. They're Jewish. And imagine adding music and like epic B-roll to this. Do you guys have a functioning brain cell? Are your neurons firing at all to digest what's actually being said, the substance of it? Because there's none of it. It's dumb slop said confidently. And when you get to the crux of it, it's literally nothing more than they are Jewish, ergo they should be allowed to do whatever they want. And if you say otherwise, you're anti-Semitic. Let's continue this dumpster fire.
And you don't acknowledge that because you just think it's, oh, white Europeans coming with the British and the American. Then yes, you're anti-Semitic.
And this is an argument they also make where it's like, if you're not white, it's allowed to do colonialism and massacre. Like, it doesn't matter if everyone in Israel is mega omega brown or white. It doesn't matter. What does that have to do with anything? Do you think if you're brown, you can do colonialism? Obviously, you don't think that, given that LonerBox denounces Palestinians for doing, like, not even remotely colonialism. Like, any Palestinian who does literally anything, he denounces. And most of them are brown.
Because your entire analysis of Israel is completely ignorant of the real experience of Jews that resulted in them going to Palestine.
The real experience, the lived experience. It's nothing. There's no substance there. It's complete slop. You might as well just say the word Jew over and over. Jewish, Jew, Jewish. That's the entire argument. It's an appeal to like a socially constructed ethnic group as if there's like an innate magical essence that makes them perennially oppressed no matter what they are, no matter who they are, no matter where they are, no matter what year we're in. A fact that you can debunk by simply looking at reality of today, where that's not the case. And even if it were the case, it would not justify colonialism. It would not justify genocide and ethnic cleansing. If you flee the Holocaust straight into a Palestinian house, and then you shoot at them when they try to return, that is the point where you stop being a refugee. Simple. A refugee lives alongside you. He does not kick you out. Another great example of this idiotic like refugee or fleeing persecution argument. Tens of thousands of Irish were forcibly deported from Ireland as indentured servants to the Caribbean and what would later become the USA by Britain. Forcibly deported in 5 to 10 year forced indenture contracts. Many of them, once their contract was up, they decided to stay, buy land or massacre Native Americans for their land, buy slaves to work the land for them. Let us try to apply LonerBox's logic to this situation. Are you saying that those Irish were simple slave owners and colonizers just because they massacred some Native Americans and bought a couple dozen black people to be slaves? Are you denying the lived experience of the poor Irish? Don't you know they literally fled? Not only did they flee persecution from Britain by the British colonizers who were genociding them, many of them were forcibly deported against their will and forced to work for British people against their will for 10 years. And then after that, they buy some slaves and they take some land from some Native Americans. And you think that you can just call them so simply slavers and colonizers? Why are you denying their lived experiences? Why are you doing anti-Irishism? It's the exact same argument. Would anyone ever say it doesn't matter they're Irish to that argument? No. So you can't just say it doesn't matter they're Jewish to the same argument made for Jews. And that's the crux of it. These sorts of arguments, they only work if you believe in some sort of innate Jewish magical essence that makes Jews oppressed irrespective of time, place, history, irrespective of reality. That gives them some sort of innate right to do things that would otherwise be impermissible. When you dissect these arguments, when you refute them on the basis of the facts, when you think about the logic behind them, that's what it always comes down to. Just how dare you, you anti-Semite? How dare you say that Jews should not be allowed to do settler colonialism, that Jews should not be allowed to have an ethno-state on the land of those people, at those people's expense? How dare you? Why? Magical Jewishness. It's that simple. That is the quintessential example of Jewish exceptionalism and the appeal to Jewishness fallacy all in one. Like, I don't know if I should need to explain this, but I will tack this on to the end of that clip. Okay? There's nothing special about Jews. Jewishness is just another socially constructed division among human beings. And no group of people should have some sort of special immaterial right to do things that would otherwise be completely impermissible for everyone else. Like settler colonialism. You know, there's a certain time where you look at something, you can say, okay, based on the material circumstances, that was justified. Like, you know, look at the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, for example. Why was that justified? Is it because the people who rose up were Jews? No, it's because they were locked into a concentration camp, sentenced to die. That is the thing that made what they did justified and good. Not the fact they were just Jews. But for someone like LonerBox, it's the first thing that makes it justified, not the latter. And that is really the crux of the issue. It's an appeal to like an arbitrary made-up division among human beings, rather than the real present circumstances of those human beings. And it's bullshit. It's dumb garbage, basically. Just ignore it. It's a joke.